Hello, my name is Brant. The day is the 6th day of June 2020. And what I want to talk to you about is a gentleman named Moses Waddel. And what he was a teacher in the backwoods of South Carolina in the early 1800s. And he's was involved in teaching boys to eventually in a classical education. So they were taught, I'm sure they were taught Latin, Greek. They were probably taught also rhetoric. And they probably were taught other classical education, probably what we call the myths of the Greeks and other subjects as math and reading and writing. And what I want to do is point out here where this particular community is, which is called Wellington, on the map here in South Carolina. And this is the extreme western part of South Carolina, what we call the Midlands, in a city called Wellington, which is not even a city, I should say, just a community. And probably there's no more than 100 people live there now. At one time it was a booming area, but no more. And what transpired here over 200 years ago was a man who came from a strict Calvinist background. So that's meant that he was very much involved in strictness and rules. And he basically educated students that were probably, I'm guessing, in the age of probably the age of 11, 12, 13 years old. And what transpired there was simply is that he taught these kids and they became leaders in their communities later on. Moses Waddel was definitely a religious man. There's what I would call students that came all the way from Charleston, South Carolina to be taught by him. And when I think about that, in today's travel, now this is today, this is over a 3-hour trip to Charleston to Wellington, South Carolina. These boys were put in what I call somewhat crude places, what I would call, they're not tents of that nature, but they had a way of building a fire within their small log cabins and having a place to sleep and to fix their own meals. This is really wild when you think about young people today. Most could not cook their own meals. And their meals consisted of basically bacon and cornbread. So it's 3 hours away in a car. So this is approximately 180 to 200 miles. So if someone was not coming by that route, which there was no railroads quite yet at that point, and so this would all have to be done by riding a crude road and a horse and buggy situation. The other thing that's important that you understand is that that these boys were from very well rich families in Charleston. One is the Pettigrew family. There are others, but that's the one that stands out to me. And you had John Calhoun, who went through here, his schooling. And John Calhoun was probably no more than 15 miles away in what we call today Abbeville County, which is a little bit is further north to the east of where, so it would not have been that far from his home. What's extraordinary about it is that he taught these boys. He apparently had a lot of wisdom. He didn't taunt his students. These those people from Charleston had the ability probably to hire a tutor. But I don't think there were any tutors in Charleston. If they were, they would be in demand pretty highly for the well-to-do. It's something you have to understand here. There are no schools at this point. And there's no public education whatsoever in the state of South Carolina. So most of the schooling was done in private, either by a tutor, or if they're Catholic, they would probably would be at a school in Charleston, some type of parochial school. The third one would be simply as the students would have to learn on their own. That would be someone would have to have the means to have books at home and to read. That's a possibility. And those who were not well off didn't have that opportunity. Although there are some students who came from this area who we would consider backwood boys, and one is Calhoun. Now, I don't know if you know who John Calhoun is. Most will not know. Even in American history, very few people don't know who he is. John Calhoun from the state of South Carolina became a senator, and eventually he became vice president of the United States. He never became the president, but he was the vice president of the United States. And he did some writings. John Calhoun had an enormous impact upon the Confederacy of South Carolina and the rest of the states that joined the Confederacy in the 1860s. John Calhoun was an avid person who defended states' rights. You see, when you look at the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, which is basically the first constitution here in the United States. It's not a constitution, it's just a general agreement with all states how to work and do certain things, and they're not into a lot of detail. It's just that this wasn't made for it. It also didn't provide for what I call the heavy taxation. It also didn't deal with what I call import taxes or export taxes. Import taxes from other countries. It could not raise an army, although they did do that, but it was not. It had to be from the states, from their militia, to work together in a common purpose. Many states at that point didn't even mint or coin their money, so there is what I would call exchange rates that took place with states. In other words, they just worked things out themselves. There was no form of government that actually ran all that. And the Articles of Confederation didn't run for about 7 or 8 years. During the war with Britain, there was no constitution at that point. That was just simply the Articles of Confederation. So this area does have other people who come here a little later on. There's a community called New Bordeaux that was about maybe 15 miles south of Wellington. And it's a French settlement that was given to those who were French, who came from France, who were Huguenot stock, who were being persecuted by the Catholic Church in France. Huguenots were probably what we call would be also Calvinists. Most French did not settle in South Carolina. There were only a small group of them, and they settled first in Charleston, and they built their own church there. which is in Charleston today. And eventually, the governor of South Carolina gave land to some Frenchmen who came here again later, and the opportunity to start their own community in New Bordeaux. And New Bordeaux is on the Savannah Riverside, so it's in the extreme western part of South Carolina, what we would call the foothill, basically Midlands to foothills. So there are not many hills here, but there is what I call the soil here is a clay, so it's different from where I'm at, which is about 65 to 75 miles away, which is basically sand and limestone after that below it. So as I digress here a little bit, I want you to understand that this is a big deal to send their sons to a school and that they're not even involved. In other words, the parents are not, they bring their kids there for a few days. You know, it takes a while to get there. They're there for a little while, and they're gone. They're gone back home. But apparently he had built up a trust with people. And I don't understand. I don't understand why Moses Waddel was here. He enjoyed the Bible naturally, and I believe he preached. But he was he enjoyed classics. He enjoyed that. And he enjoyed teaching classics education. He enjoyed reading per se, and so what he did was most of these students they recited in Latin, in Greek, and I think in Hebrew languages that he'd given them. So they recite, I don't know, pages of information, and they would memorize it. There's only one book. As far as I know, and I guess he basically either copied this and gave them whatever, or either maybe he had some way of actually giving them some type of part of the book. I don't know, but I know that his parents would pay him, so maybe he was able to get these books published and have them transported. I think that's what he did to give to students. What's really naturally, this area is, and I want to point out something else about South Carolina. I said that earlier that French didn't settle here, that many. No, there were very few French that settled here, very few. The groups that settled here were by far the English, by far. Not even close. And then the next group that would be Scotch-Irish, who most came in from up north and then eventually settled in South Carolina. Most would go through either New York or Philadelphia to Seaport, and then would discover that the land was already taken in the state of New York or Pennsylvania, and so they came south. Many of them came south to Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. But why was his students? Why was he successful? Well, I think one thing that stood out to me that he was successful was simply is that he gave them. He was rigid. He made it hard for them. He was not an easy teacher. He wasn't mean. He just simply was hard. And what I understand, they were as boys are at that age, they do all kinds of pranks to each other, and especially for those who are less educated or less well-to-do, would be in other words. I'm sure that these boys I think they had someone who, as I remember in the book, someone did wash their clothes, or either they washed them themselves. I'm pretty sure that they had somebody else to do that for them, but they were responsible for cooking their food. There's no doubt they had to gather. They had to gather wood themselves to um, build their fires so they could actually cook. We're spoiled in that situation because we don't do that. We're not taught that at that early age. Um, so he was successful in basically keeping them strict and learning. Um, there were very few teachers who taught what he taught. And I should say, many of the students went on and became leaders. Um, Three or four of them became governors of Alabama. A couple of them became governors of Georgia. There was probably three or four also in the state of South Carolina became governors. They became they were at the top of the class, and in many respects, some ruled. Not ruled. Some actually were presidents of railroads later on. And in Wellington, eventually, the railroad did come through there and build a railroad through there, and eventually back up to Anderson, South Carolina, which later in the 1800s would become a textile center, as well as Greenwood, South Carolina. And the Charleston and Western Railroad built tracks through this area out of McCormick, South Carolina. And McCormick's named after the inventor Cyrus McCormick, who invented farm equipment. So, what else? Why is this important? I think it's important to understand it simply is that hard work, being independent and responsibility led these men to become leaders. I think the parents knew what they were doing. I think they understood it simply is that to be away from mommy and daddy allowed these students to be on their own, making decisions, also being responsible at a young age. Moses Waddel was so successful that the school in Athens, Georgia, asked him to come there, which was Franklin College. Today it's known as the University of Georgia. In the later I think it's basically 1822, in that age part, Moses Waddel was basically asked to come to Athens to help a school that basically was on its last legs financially. Meaning that basically the school is about to go broke until it gets someone to lead it and teach and get it on stable grounds. And Moses Waddel did do that. And by reading this book here, Moses Waddel did not enjoy teaching in Athens. He is very feels threatened in some ways by the students because they're older, and he's getting older. So they're in the neighborhood of 18 to 22 years old. Again, some of these are well-to-do kids, and they're spoiled. Already are spoiled at a young age. They are out carousing at night, drinking liquor, moonshine. So he didn't have that control that he had with his kids. And he was there, was successful. He was successful. He got Franklin College out of what we call basically not going bankrupt, and eventually becomes the University of Georgia. And he leaves there, and he comes back to Wellington to teach, and it's not quite the same anymore. And he does it for another maybe 10 years, and then he's no longer. He's no longer involved. So his golden years was in the early 1800s. I think what he was there at the right time to allow kids to become men. And it was the right timing, no doubt about it. He was there for a purpose. The kids were there for a purpose, and those kids eventually became leaders in the community in the state of South Carolina and other states. And that's key, very key. When you think about it, I was talking with someone today, and we were talking that many South Carolina boys who had education, most would go north. Many of them would. The state of South Carolina College was started in 1801. I think 1801. Had very few students. Struggled also financially to stay on its feet. And the College of Charleston, I think, is a little later on. I think it's the second oldest institution that is a college here in South Carolina. And it's a private school. So there is other schools in the state here, but I think they're later on. Most are going to be what I call, in fact, Erskine College is in the 1820s and 1830s when it gets its start. But it's a school, but it's a private school, and private schools at that time were far more expensive to teach than it was for public. I'm sorry, had better professors or teachers than the state colleges. Okay, follow me? So, the State College of South Carolina, which is the first institution here of higher learning, 1801, had very few students and probably no more than 4 professors. If they had that many, they were teaching probably a student class of maybe 20 to 25. And they were state regulated, and they were considered second class. They were not considered the better schools. Most students who had good grades would go to Yale, William and Mary, and Harvard, or any other high Ivy League school. And those are all private schools. They're not public schools in the sense of that. When I say public schools, I mean public colleges. So it's interesting how this transpired. Today, it's with the state schools are far more ahead now. When I say that, they have far more professors. I don't know if we would get a better education there. It depends on what you're there for. And also simply is that private schools have good professors also, but they cost more, far more. Your tax money in the state of South Carolina provides for education. When I went to University of South Carolina at Eton for a full year, no school board. That is, I went back and forth to school, did not stay on the campus per se. There wasn't any boarding or student housing at all at that point. And it was about 1,800 students when I was there in the late 70s and early 80s. And the tuition for me, I want to explain this to you, it's very clear. It was less than $1,300 a year. And that's including books. That's taking 15 hours each semester. So that's 30 hours. And if I took a class or two in the summer, I would get another probably 6 hours, so 36 per se. I took far more classes than I should have, but that was because my advisor basically goofed. So I took 132 hours instead of 120, which is for a bachelor's degree. So, but anyway, that's a long time ago. So I hope that you enjoyed this. Again, we'll talk about other things in the future, but this is one person I wanted to talk about was Moses Waddel. And I appreciate your time, and you have a great day. Thank you.